Here we go. We've got a few people coming in now. Hello. Welcome to this SU20 digital session, a guide to supporting Black students. We're going to give it a bit of time because I think it's going to be a popular session. We want to make sure that everybody's here for the start before we get going. You may have been to some of these sessions already, as with the others. Could you introduce yourselves in the chat? It's always nice to see who's here and get an opportunity to meet other people who are also interested in these kind of topics for further discussion later. Give it a few more moments. Just to let everybody know that this session is also going to be recorded and available through the SU20 digital website for viewing later. So anybody who you know is interested in this kind of thing and unavailable to watch right now, or you'd like to review back and watch this topic again, it's going to be there, and that should be there available shortly under the replay section. Hi guys, nice to see some people introducing themselves there in the chat. That's wonderful. Okay. Okay, so like I say, a guide to supporting Black students. We've got Agare here from the co-founder of Minds of People of Color, a development consultancy service interested in improving the mental health support for people of color. So I'm going to hand over now and we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Can you hear me before you run away? Could you just let me know if you can hear me, please?
I can hear you just fine. Yeah,
okay,
thank
cool. Thank you. So welcome everyone. It's great to see the interaction in the chat. So like just continue using the chat function and introducing yourself in there and have a conversation with each other. I assume you're all here because we all have the same kind of vested interest in supporting Black students. So it's good to build connections. So as Jamie said, my name is Oge. And I am one half of Minds of People of Color. So I am one of the co-founders. Minds of POC is a development consultancy service interested in improving the mental health support of people of color. And we do this through consultations, trainings, and workshops, just as this one. And that kind of sets the foundation for the work, the long-term work we should all strive to do collectively. So a bit about me, I'm a law graduate from the University of Leicester. And then I was elected as Wellbeing Officer in the year 2018/19, and then re-elected as president in the year 1920. So I ran on a platform to support the most marginalized, and that was what I was all about. And so I dedicated essentially my 2 years in office to doing exactly that, and to supporting Black students and imagining new ways of learning in a way that really supports the most marginalized. So I only have half an hour for this session. So it's going to be kind of like a quick whistle-stop tour of a decolonization and a decolonized education, but it doesn't really go into detail. So I just want you to keep that in mind. And then at the end, there'll be like 5 or 10 minutes for questions. I wanted to add some trigger warnings, just in case it can be triggering for some. It's not always nice to hear statistics about racial violence and how institutional racism affects yourself if you are a Black person in the room, and your community. So just so you know, this is a space for you. So use that space how you like and learn and teach me in the process too. So we're going to be covering today just some myths and terms in relation to language. So I said decolonizing education, but I'm aware that not everyone might know what that means. I'm going to take you through a Black student's journey and their experience and their relationship with education. And then we're going to understand the importance of this. So why have we done this? Why have you come today? And then finally, together, I'd like us to identify practical steps that SUs and student officers can take to build that foundation for change. So like I said, use the chat function if you have ideas. If you have comments, it doesn't always have to be a question as well. Let's reimagine the way we think of an educator. So I'm not the only educator in the room. So do throw in comments in as well. So just to think about defining terms. So if you're a new officer, you might come across some terms in your role. Or if you're new to students' unions as well, you could be a staff member. There are some key terms that kind of come up in relation to liberation that you might not be aware of. So decolonization, what do I mean by that? And it's a process of freeing minds and structures from colonial ideology. So interrogating assumptions and their origins within widely used models and frameworks. And there are amazing campaigns that happen or have happened within students' unions across the country. Why is my curriculum white? My Racist Campus, Decolonizing Education, all started by amazing student activists. And these all contribute toward a decolonized, free, liberated education that supports the most marginalized. You might hear the term awarding gap. I say awarding gap. At MPOC, Minds of PSC, we use awarding gap, but you might hear attainment as well. And this is the significant and persistent disparity in the awarding of degrees between different groups of students. So there's a mature students awarding gap, there's a disabled students awarding gap, but specifically today we're focusing on the Black student awarding gap and how we can close that gap. So at Leicester, we use the term awarding rather than attainment, because attainment really focuses on what a student attains and what that student has attained. But we know that the awarding gap is a structural issue, and it's a manifestation of institutional racism. And so we need to place the onus on universities and on institutions. And that's why we say awarding gap, because it really focuses on what the university awards students as opposed to what students attain. I hope that makes sense. And I really do implore you all to interrogate the language we use, because it's so important in relation to achieving change. So look at what language we use and maybe start using awarding instead, so that we can really focus on tackling the structural issue. Race relations can be quite complicated, so I thought it's important to define some terms. So we are Minds of POC, MPOC, and people of color refers to people who are of African, Caribbean, Asian, Latin American, and Arab descent. It's a term that's widely used in the States, and it was reclaimed, it was used kind of to take away from terms such as non-white or minority that was imposed on people of color. In the UK, excuse me, in the UK, a more widely used term that you'll hear is BAME or BME, especially in relation to statistics. It's what the government uses, and that stands for Black and Asian minority ethnic people. When we talk about whiteness, so I might say whiteness, I'll talk about that, and I'm talking about a structure. I'm not talking about white people specifically, because we know that race is a social construct. There's no biological basis for race. And when we know that, then we understand that whiteness is a structure and a tool that sets the standard to which society is held and the lens through which processes are created. It's a violent tool. There's a violent history in relation to whiteness that upholds existing power structures. And this requires for there to be someone at the bottom. So even today, Black people are at the bottom in relation to race, and so that's why there is racism in the UK and in the world. So just to define institutional racism, which is what I'll be speaking about this afternoon, this is the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people. Ooh. The collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture, or ethnic origin. So there are different manifestations of institutional racism. Black people are less likely to be hired. Statistics shows that particularly Nigerian women are more likely to have their CVs thrown in the bin because of their name, Nigerian and Pakistani women. there are disproportionate use of stop and search and excessive force against young Black boys, and this has specifically increased during the coronavirus pandemic. And another manifestation of institutional racism is the awarding gap, and the disparity between the awards that Black students receive and white students receive. And so I think it's very important to bring in context. And so that's why I wanted to take you through a Black student's journey. So if you are someone in the room that's not Black, I'm about to give you a sneak peek into a Black student's relationship with education institutions, right up from school age. So Black students are disproportionately punished in school, just thinking about their hairstyles and the way that that's policed, the clothes they wear. And SUs can do so much more to work with colleges and schools in the local area. I want you to think big. So if you really want to support Black students at your university, I think collectively higher education has responsibility in the way in which we interact with Black students from a much earlier age. Have you considered getting involved in widening participation initiatives that your university runs? If your university doesn't run any widening participation initiatives that support Black students, maybe as an SU staff member or officer, you can pitch that idea to them. Have you thought about a mentorship scheme between Black university students that you support and Black school students in the area? So really think big, be imaginative in our approach in supporting Black students. A mentorship scheme also supports students at your university, so it's not just for the benefit of the mentees too. So think big, be imaginative and creative. Black boys are 168 times more likely to be permanently excluded from school than a white British girl. And this contributes to the school to prison pipeline. I can't go into too much detail about what that is in this talk, but I would implore you to do some research about what the school to prison pipeline is. But there's a connection between state schools and prison, and the way Black people are treated in schools and the way they're treated in prison, especially in relation to those that are permanently excluded from schools. So if a Black student is more likely to be excluded from school, this might hinder their access to higher education. Although statistics show that Black students are twice as likely to go to university than their white counterparts. And what that tells me is that there's a zeal, there's a desire for Black students to be in the room. They want to be in higher education, they want to learn. And so what is the issue then? If they want to be here, why are they not retaining or attaining as well grades as their white peers? Why are they not remaining in higher education, which we'll talk about later? Or if they want to be here, why are they not going to the University of Cambridge? Do Black students not want to go there? Because I would have loved to go to Cambridge if I had the opportunity. This year, Cambridge had 200 Black undergraduates, and this is this year's statistics, and that is roughly out of 12,000 undergraduate students that they had this year. So if Black students want to go to university, are they only going to specific universities? So that's something that we need to think about when we talk about access to higher education. And then retention as well. So they've accessed higher education despite being more likely to be permanently excluded. They're now at university. But statistics show that Black students are 50% more likely to drop out than their white and Asian counterparts. With the individual and structural issues that Black students fight on a daily basis, battling through unresolved racial trauma and a lack of support, it's vital that we do what we can to reduce the rates of Black students dropping out. Specific data from the Office for Students has found the awarding gap is even exacerbated among students who have mental health conditions, with a gap of 26% between white and Black students. So continuation rates for students with mental health difficulties are also exacerbated. So as a whole, Black students, 85% of Black students go on to their second year. but 77% of Black students with a mental health condition go on to their second year. So it's even exacerbated when they have a mental health issue. And that's why MPOCS has a specific focus on mental health and how we can support a Black student, people of color's well-being as a whole. Since 2013/14, the continuation rates for full-time students improved for all ethnic groups, which is a win. However, there was no improvement for Black students. So once again, that's why it's important to focus on the most marginalized. It's also important to remember that this data is for students who've disclosed a mental health issue. And we know that Black students are less likely, due to cultural reasons, to disclose a mental health issue or to be diagnosed with one. So even just thinking about how the data is skewed and how much more the issue is compared to what we actually know. So they've managed to get into university despite being more likely to be excluded. They've managed to defy all retention statistics that say they're more likely to drop out. So what are Black students being awarded at university? So 81% of white students are being awarded a 2-1 or above, compared to 55% of Black students. So the awarding gap stands at 26%. So they've been awarded, they've graduated. Even then, when they go into employment, they're more likely to be unemployed. So Black men have the lowest employment rates. And then just thinking about whether or not they want to go into academia. Last year, I think I just always think about the statistic because it's very close to home, because I am a person that wants to go into academia. And Dr. Nicola Rollock has done some research into UK professors, and only 25 Black women professors are in the UK as of 2019. And this is in comparison to 19,000 professors across the entire UK. So I just think about how small a number that is. And for someone that wants to go into academia, just researching Dr. Nicola's report has been insightful. Just some of the things that some Black women professors have to face on a day-to-day is very interesting, but also very sad. And the reason cited essentially was racism. So why is this important? Why have I taken you through this journey? Why, you're asking me? So what? I don't know about you, but I'm a very angry person. And I always allow things like this to make me angry. And I always say anger is very good once it's controlled and channeled. I think it's a very beautiful emotion and very effective when we're trying to make change. So do allow these statistics to make you angry. Allow the truth to hone in and take that anger and make something beautiful and wonderful out of it. Nobody's free until everybody's free. And that is something that we live by at MPOC. It's so important to support the most marginalized in society so that we can achieve liberation for us all. And this is why we have a specific focus on supporting Black students and Black individuals when we're supporting people of color. And this is due to the disproportionate impact that Black folk face when faced with institutional racism. I think it's important to understand that things do not happen in isolation. So when you are supporting Black students, say, for example, you're lobbying for more Black counsellors, what you're doing is lobbying for more counsellors. And what that does is support everyone, because you're asking for more counsellors. And so that supports, in turn, the entire student body. So a truly decolonized education is a win for everyone, because it doesn't just support Black students in isolation. It's a good thing for everyone. And as students' unions, we have a duty to support our students, particularly the most marginalized, who are also paying their tuition fees to attend your university. So once you continue to remind yourself of the importance, this allows you to maintain progress and continue the good fight that we need to fight in order to support Black students. So let's imagine some things that can be done. Once again, do use the chat function if you're thinking some things, your mind's racing. Think about practical steps that SUs and students can take. If you attended the other talk ran by MPOC, so the other co-founder, Sana Ali, delivered a session yesterday on supporting students of colour and their mental health. She brought up some examples specifically related to well-being. I'm going to run through quickly. Just having a look at your mental health services. Do you have Black counsellors? Can you lobby for Black counsellors? Can you speak to your university and say, well, we don't have any, because they're more likely to not have any, and just say, hello, we'd like funding to go into this specific action, which is to hire Black counsellors. Are Black students truly given a space for healing? Are we only doing de-stress events or events during exam season? Have you just told a Black person to go to yoga to fix generations of racial trauma instead of tackling the issue at hand? So we really should be lobbying university for training on cultural competency, because when we do this, then we can really understand the context and the history and the background of Black students so that we can fully support them. So just lobbying your university for more funding into the counselling and wellbeing service, training that their wellbeing service can go on and things like that. Looking at education, have a look at your lecturers. If you're in the room and you are a graduate right now, think about yourself. How many Black lecturers did you have at university? I think I can count mine with one hand. And it's important that Black students have a role model and they have someone that they can go to, if, you know, and they have someone that they can see. Once again, just thinking about myself as someone that wants to go into academia, I saw one other Black woman in law who I used to mentor me. So just think about the experiences of Black students that don't see themselves in education. At Leicester, one thing we did was we worked with our Pro Vice Chancellor, who was the head of college for social sciences, arts and humanities, and she'd pledged funding into PhD scholarships for BME candidates. That was amazing. But what we did with effective lobbying was ask for one of the 3 scholarships to be ring-fenced specifically for Black students. And we used what we know about how Black students are disproportionately affected in order to achieve that. So we know that when we're looking at statistics for the BAME awarding gap, and when we're trying to support BAME students, usually when there's progression, that progression is because of the Asian students, and we don't see progression for Black students. So in recent years, the BAME awarding gap has been decreasing, but the Black awarding gap hasn't. So although within BAME, we feel like we're supporting Black students, what we really need to do is hone in on the data and statistics and really interrogate data in relation to Black students. So another thing you can do is speak to whoever's in charge of managing the BAME awarding gap, because hopefully someone is, and if there isn't, once again, that's something you should be speaking to your universities about, and ask them for specific data on the Black awarding gap, because then you'll be able to see the disparity a lot clearer. Thinking about sport provision, are Black students accessing sport? Are Black students in positions of leadership in relation to sport? Often you will find it's because of a lack of access to funds, which acts as a barrier. So Black students are more likely to be from working class backgrounds. Last year, our sports officer, who's now the president of Leicester Students' Union, lobbied for a pot of funding for students from lower income backgrounds to access sport, and then asked for some of that funding to be specific for Black students to access the fund. And so don't be shy to say the word Black. Don't be shy, don't be colorblind in your approach. I think it's very important to recognize that there's a disparity for Black students, and you should be able to say, well, we need something or an initiative in place for Black students specifically. So once again, don't be shy in the term Black, because institutional racism definitely is not shy when it's attacking Black students. I think it's so important as students' unions that we look inward. A lot of the time we think we're a beacon of liberation and we do everything to support students, but we can do so much more, and SUs can do so much more. Do we invest in societies that support Black students? Do you call on your African and Caribbean society, Nigerian society, Somali society, your West Indian society? Are they appropriately funded and supported? Do you speak to them outside of Black History Month? about anything. So are we only calling on them for their labour is something we need to think about as students' unions as well. Most importantly, it's always, I think, the start to look at yourselves. So it's important to look at universities, at students' unions, but also as an individual. What are you doing specifically to listen to Black students and their concerns? I think it's very important not to invalidate anyone's personal experiences as well. So do involve Black students in key decision making, especially in relation to how they need to be supported at your institution. With this specifically, I think it's important to be very careful. So sometimes students' unions can run to do a focus group, but what you're asking in a focus group of Black students is to relive years and years of trauma that they've had to go through. So think about why that's an issue. And so if we're asking anyone for their labour, we are compensating them in the process or offering counselling or support afterward as well. And finally, do continue to actively learn and unlearn. The revolution starts and begins in your mind. So do start to, within yourself to continue to read and learn and also unlearn anything that you've previously learned. So just to remind everyone, because it's coming to the end of this, we are a development consultancy service focused on improving mental health support for people of colour. Our mantra is that in order to achieve better mental health for people of colour, we need to get to the root of their issues, and that is tackling racism, white supremacy, and a capitalist society that continues to oppress us. And so we offer consultations, so having a look through policies and procedures, race equity training and workshops, microaggressions, how to be anti-racist, and so on. And all of this supports people of colour and their mental health. So if you would like to find out more about our service, do get in touch via Twitter, Instagram, our email's there. We don't have a website just yet, but it's coming. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you all. Once again, Sana and I used to be officers as well, so we know exactly where students' unions are coming from, and we're here to help and support as well. So do get in touch. If anyone had any questions, I've seen some in the chat box.
Hi again. I can help with that if you would like.
Yeah.
Yeah, but first of all, thank you very much for that talk. Very insightful. I'm sure lots of people got a lot from it today. So thank you.
So. I always say it's just a conversation between us. So if you've learnt from me, please do teach me. Use the chat box as a comment tool as well if you'd like to. You don't always have to ask a question.
Great. Yeah, there are some questions come through. Yeah, okay. First one, hopefully an easy one to get us started. Somebody's asked if the statistics that you're using in your presentation are from the UK, just from the UK, or is that a more global picture?
No, so we only ever use UK statistics. We use people of colour, even though it derived from the US, but no, we use UK statistics. And we have statistics related to the school to prison pipeline. That's also specific to the UK, even though the whole kind of term came from the US and so on. But yeah, I do find it's quite hard to find UK statistics in relation to race. But we use data from the Office for Students, from the NUS UK report as well. If you haven't seen that report, I think that's a really good place to start your reading. So it was a joint report between the National Union of Students and the Universities UK, and it's on the awarding gap, the BAME awarding gap.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a question here that says, I'm really interested in exploring the possibility of having a BAME sabbatical officer, which would be new for them. But they're concerned that this will leave the responsibility for, very important work all in the hands and the lap of one person. But then equally, it should be somebody's job. Like there's enough work for a full-time job, so they're trying to balance these two things. Have you got any advice or any thoughts on that?
I think I think it's important, you're right, that there is one, but it's also important that the burden and the labor isn't always placed on that person. So just thinking about a BAME officer, that person has to come from, or that person has to be a person of color. And so they're going through their university degree, their own personal trauma, while also trying to support other students of color that have trauma. So the burden shouldn't just be on them solely, but it should be, I think what would be effective if you want a BAME officer, because we had one at Leicester, is to also include liberation in the job descriptions of the other roles. And that's something you could effectively lobby for at your students' union, or change if you're an officer. So if it's permeated throughout all roles, then that should relieve a bit of the burden on the BAME officer. But it's an important role. But it's also important that that role and the person in that role has set boundaries for themselves.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thank you. There's a whole load of them. They're coming quite quickly now, so I'll just
Right.
keep going through them. Is it useful to distinguish between Black students from middle class families and those from working class families, do you think?
That's a really good question. Um, I'd need more. So what's the distinguish? Why are we making that distinction? What's the benefit of making that distinction, and what are the connotations to the pros and cons of making such a distinction? At the end of the day, all Black individuals experience anti-Black racism. The editor of Vogue tweeted the other day that he stepped into the office and was pulled up by security. I attended a talk the other day, and a QC, so a barrister QC, who's pretty high ranking, when they're being ushered to into the courts, they're often sometimes led to the dock, as if it's automatic. So you could be from any background. You could be Obama and you'd still experience anti-Black racism. So it'd be important so that you know why you're making that distinction and what that's for.
Yeah.
Because then you can know whether or not to, but it doesn't seem like it's something that has any benefit.
Maybe if the person who asked that question has a specific case, if you could pop that back into the questions, maybe we'll get round to that. But thank you. And I'm just doing them in the order that they've come through here.
No worries.
Is there differences in Black student experiences at, say, Russell Group universities compared to non-Russell Group universities? Do you have any experience?
Well, yeah, just from kind of my relationship as an officer, I worked with some other officers across the country, and just thinking about some of the issues that officers in Russell Group universities faced in comparison to other universities. So you'll often find that those in other universities, although it's hard to tackle institutional racism across the country, but those in Russell Group universities had a harder time having to deal with issues related to supporting students of color. So to answer the question, yes, there is a difference, but sometimes, because institutions can really surprise you, so you never really know. There are some institutions that are Russell Groups that do really good work and do what they can to support students of color, particularly Black students, but it is rare to find them. But there is a difference, yeah. Okay. I'm just thinking about how deep colonialism runs through some universities, particularly Russell Groups, as well. Just knowing that then could show you that there's a difference between the two.
Thank you. There's a question here. It says it's about the term BAME, and I know that there's been some discussions about it already, and some other discussions in some of our other talks at SU20 Digital. But this question is asking, do you feel BAME is an appropriate term? The Black students that this person's consulted prefer not to use the term, whereas they're finding
Mm,
that Asian students are pro the term.
mm.
And then they have collectives at their SU, so, and they have a BAME collective, and they're wondering whether this should be reconsidered.
Yeah, this question was asked yesterday to Sana and her
Oh,
talk, and I thought, yes. So as a Black woman, I don't identify as a person of color. I don't say I am BAME. I don't think anyone says they're BAME. I personally don't know anyone that does. But I specifically use Black, and I say I am Black. You'll find a lot of people identify by their ethnicity as well. There's nothing wrong with a collective term that's used as a tool to fight white supremacy. But within that, I think it's also important to interrogate that term. So although we might use it to organize and we might use that tool, that term as a tool to fight white supremacy, we can also kind of interrogate it and self-criticize that specific term. So we can acknowledge that there's an issue with using BAME and there's an issue with using person of color in our work, although we need a term that kind of collectivizes struggle. Some terms are very problematic, some terms are very corporate, so BAME and BME is very corporate and it's utilized by institutions. When you often hear it when it's in relation to statistics and data, but there's nothing wrong with having a BAME collective if people are comfortable with that. But it's also fine to say, well, we recognize that this is a problematic term, even though you are using the term.
okay, thank you. Another question here, that how can access and education officers tackle the intersection between race and class, as there's often a focus on white working class kids, mainly white working class boys in particular. Um, does this create a divide if we highlight the intersection between race and class? So kind of two bits there, I think.
Could you repeat the question? Because
Yeah.
I want to take the
How can access and education officers tackle the intersection between race and class? And then they're saying that they think the focus tends to be on white working class boys, mainly males, and they're wondering if this creates a divide between, like, does this create a divide if we highlight the intersection between race and class?
No, it does not create a divide. I think it's very important to know that there it's almost very difficult to distinguish between race and class, because Black and brown individuals are more likely to be from working class backgrounds. You do find that a lot of institutions focus on getting white working class boys into education. So I did highlight some statistics that say that Black students are twice as more likely to get in to try and access university compared to white students, and that's because there's a zeal and there's a desire on their part, and white working class boys, specifically from up north, are less likely to try and access higher education. And so because of that, institutions tend to place a lot of focus on them, but we can't deny that that people of color are more likely to be working class as well. I think universities use data that focuses on region, and if you're from London, then you're seen as wealthy and working class in comparison to someone that's middle class in comparison to someone that's from up north, and that's problematic in itself, because we know that there are a lot of people of color that are from London, a lot of Black people from London, particularly from South London and North London, who are also working class as well. But because they're defined by their postcode, that's supposed to be a rich area, the statistics are really skewed. And so when it comes to race and class, we shouldn't deny the intersex, and it doesn't create division when we do that. So we should always understand that people of color are more likely to be working class. And if there's a focus on specifically just white working class individuals, at your institution, that's something that needs to be interrogated and you can lobby against as well.
Great, thank you. Question here. How can we advocate for universities and student unions to hire black students, staff, and academics when they come, the complaint back from the institution is that their employment is based on merit? So how do we try and encourage that to take place?
Right. I think when you hear we're hiring on merit and we're not, looking at race, what that sounds to me is they don't think Black people deserve to be in such positions, because if it were the case that Black and brown people, were not smart enough to be in the room, then fair enough. But that's not true, and we know it's not true, and we know that biologically white people are not smarter than Black people, for example. So why are Black and brown individuals not being hired? And it's not because it has nothing to do with merit. And the statistics, you can bring up the data to show that it has everything to do with institutional racism. And what we did at Leicester when we were trying to hire Black counsellors, so the university would kind of advertise on Indeed and on the university website, and then they'd come back and say, well, we only had 6 applicants and they were all white. And we'd go back and say, well, you didn't try hard enough to try and get Black applicants. And so we asked them to advertise in different places. And so they put the job advertisement in women's centres that were mainly South Asian, in the African and Caribbean Centre, which was in Leicester, and they advertised to a more diverse group. And they've come back and said, well, actually, we've had more applicants from Black and brown applicants as well. And none of them were any less hireable than any of the other white candidates. So it just goes to show that institutions need to do much more to make themselves accessible to Black and brown potential applicants. So it has nothing to do with merit, and we know that because of the stats from institutional racism, and you should be able to bring that up in response.
Great, thank you. Good practical advice there as well. Get it out to the right audience.
Yeah, don't just advertise to the same people, because you're going to get the same applicants.
So, sorry, there's so many. That's
okay. Coming in. How long do we have?
Well, for my time, I'm okay up to, let me just double check. Sorry, this is not very professional, as you just know. Up to I think I've got up to 1 o'clock.
Okay, that's fine with me.
If you're okay.
Yes.
Brilliant. So this question is asking, would students of colour feel more comfortable with their counsellor being a person of colour from their ethnicity? So would a Black student be more at ease with a Black counsellor rather than an Asian counsellor?
That's a good question. I am not the spokesperson for every single student of colour, so I wouldn't be able to answer that on behalf of every single student of colour. But from my experience, representation politics is very dangerous. And so I know I'm asking for universities to hire more Black lecturers, and I'm asking for universities to hire more Black counsellors. What we really want and what we really need is counsellors, lecturers, staff members that are for Black people. So, and that could be a white counsellor. My personal experience, I've never had a white counsellor do that for me. A lot of them are not culturally competent, the ones I had dealt with, but there are, and there are training sessions that counsellors can go on to make them culturally competent. So the reason we ask for cultural competency is specifically so that Black and brown students don't have to constantly relive their trauma and explain their context and explain their background, which takes up 3 sessions. So the first 3 sessions are spent explaining your Blackness and explaining your race, when that could have all just kind of been understood from the start. And so I've had a Black woman as a counsellor who just knew my context immediately. So I'm not spending sessions explaining it to her. And so that's why it's important to have Black and brown people in positions where they can support individuals. But that's not to say that white staff members can't do the same thing. And it once again goes to show, it goes back to just having people that know how to support Black students and want to, because you can know, but you might not want to do that, or you might not have the energy to do that. It might seem like it's a burden, an extra burden on you to be culturally competent. So essentially, to answer the question, is not always. There are Black counsellors that might not be for Black people. We know that from specific MPs in certain positions who are Black or brown that aren't always for their people. So.
Should we push Black students in sixth form and college to apply to Oxbridge, LSE, Imperial, Durham, those big universities, if we know that they're going to have a hard time being at one of the less diverse universities?
You're going to have a hard time everywhere. As a Black or brown individual, as a person of color, you're going to have a hard time in any institution, because every single institution is institutionally racist. So there might be a difference, there might be a disparity between the way, University of Leicester students are treated compared to the way University of Cambridge students are treated. But essentially, you're still going to have to go through such a violent structure that isn't built for you. So you can push them to Cambridge, you can push them to a university that's pre-19, that's a research university or a Russell Group, but either way, they're still going to experience some kind of violence. So what we should be focusing on is fixing that before we think about what universities are better than what, because even just planting that idea in a person's head, just saying, well, if you don't go to one of these ones, you'll be fine. Well, that's not the case, because the data shows that either way, the awarding gap is national. It's not just specific to certain universities.
Yeah, I suppose you don't want to put the emphasis on the individual. It should be on that institution, right? If they're not diverse, there's a problem there in itself, and
Yeah,
that's the bit that needs looking at.
There are some students that are in Warwick that have an amazing time because of the others. There are some Black students at Warwick that have an amazing time because of the other Black students that are with them. But then you could go to a different university and find that, the Black students that are with you aren't really for you, and so on. So, your experience might change and it might differ depending on the university, but essentially every single institution is violent in their treatment of Black individuals, and so that's what we should be focusing
on. There's a question here about anti-racism workshops, workshops during Freshers Week, and do they actually work, or is it just an avenue to pay lip service to something from a university? Bit of a skeptical question there, I think.
No, I love things like that, because it's something that Sana and I were thinking about before we founded Minds of POC, because it's about what do we actually need to achieve real change, and I think a lot of universities, some students' unions too, are not exempt. They would go on a workshop and say, well, we've done this workshop and that's it, that's me done. But we know that a workshop or training is only the foundation for your learning. That's literally only step one of 1,000 steps that you need to take in order for us to achieve race equity. So I can understand that for some, it would be used as a cop-out. But if you're constantly learning and using that workshop or that training in a useful way and in a resourceful way throughout, like in a 5-year plan, then I think that is a lot more useful than just having one workshop and so on. So it's important to be skeptical and to ask, so what's the point of this workshop? Where does it lead us? Because really workshops and training sessions are only the start. and it's never the end of any kind of learning that we do.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm going to try and...
So if, just to add, so if they are saying, well, we're doing this workshop, it should be part of some kind of 5-year plan that they have, or a 3-year plan, or a 1-year plan. So it should never just be just this one workshop.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just going to combine these two questions because I think they're sort of, they're making comparisons. So they're asking, is there a difference in experience for Black students that are studying at university in London as opposed to those outside of London? And then also a question about studying in rural communities and what SUs can do to help in those different kinds of situations.
I think it's all dependent on context, isn't it? So if a student is studying in London, they're more likely to be a commuter student. And what we need to build is a sense of community among Black students. And if there isn't that communal feel from a London university, then that might affect their university experience and journey. Black students in rural areas, I know that especially if they're in areas that are more likely to have overt displays of racism, it might affect their student journey. So it's really different depending on the university. But once again, I just want to reiterate that institutional racism permeates through every single institution. So every institution has an obligation to support Black students.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, questions have just jumped around again. I think we're sort of coming towards a close, so we'll ask the last one or two questions.
Are there any comments?
There's somebody's made a comment. You referred to being able to count your Black lecturers on one hand. Somebody said that they can count theirs on no hands, and that was disappointing. But we've got a few people introducing themselves there in the comments, but aside from that, that's where they are. There's a follow-up question on the when we were talking about middle class students. It says rich international students may have a different experience when it comes to navigating the university. Black students from more affluent families who went to private school are more likely to be accustomed to a Russell Group university, which is filled with white middle class students. And I think it says, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. It's not really so much a question, more of a comment.
More a comment. Yeah, like I said, I love comments. We welcome them. I don't deny their experiences, but those are the experiences of the minority. So as mentioned, Black people are more likely to be from working class backgrounds, and so I think it's important that we keep that in mind when we are supporting Black students, and we shouldn't just focus on the minority that is affluent. And like I said already, regardless, Black students come across anti-Black racism, and they will. And I also provided statistics of international students that are less likely to be hired after university. So that's why I went through the entire journey, because I don't think we should just focus on them being at university at the time, but also when they graduate. So data shows that Nigerian international students are more likely to have their CV thrown in the bin, especially if they're women. And no amount of money can stop having your CV thrown in the bin, unless, of course, there's nepotism involved. But just thinking about things like that, I think we should focus on the fact that Black students are more likely to be from working class backgrounds, and every single Black student will face anti-Black racism.
And then I think the final question, because we don't have too much time left, is they've just moved again. Well, I can't see it now, but the question was asking about the mental health experiences and the differences, if there are significant differences between Black female students and Black male students and their experiences, if there's any differences, and whether we should, like, what we can do to support those two different groups.
So at the start, I did mention that it's so important to be creative and imaginative in our thinking and in new ways of learning. When I was wellbeing officer, that was one of my aims. And so we know that women are more likely to access mental health services, specifically white women. And so it's the same when it comes to white men as well, more likely to access services compared to Black men. And I think that's also important to consider in terms of the intersect between race and gender. So Black men don't access mental health support, and the suicide rates among Black men are very high. But then also Black women struggle in terms of misogynoir, and that is a term referred to misogyny and sexism that women face, that's specific to their race, so specifically Black women face. So it's important that to understand that both of their journeys with mental health, both Black men, including trans men, and both Black women, including trans women, are very, very different. But ultimately, Black students in general and their relationship with mental health is one that we need to tackle, and we need to be imaginative when doing so as well. So I think we ran de-stress events in my year as wellbeing officer, and I specifically had a barbershop. It was like a pop-up barbershop for Black men, and that was a really good and safe space for them to just kind of be, because that's where usually Black men go to unwind and so on. And so we had a pop-up barbershop. They could get a free haircut, and the barbers as well were playing music and they were talking to them. So that was a really good space for them. And just doing that in the Students' Union, and that was an introduction for them to me as wellbeing officer. So they knew they could come to me if they needed anything. I've created spaces for Black women as well, specifically to come together and to just be, and a space for them to just be and to just to heal and find new ways of healing as well. So there are different things that we can do to look at the intersect and to understand that there is a problem, and also to encourage Black trans folk to get involved in students' unions, and thinking of ways we can do that too.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We're going to have to stop, unfortunately. There's still loads of questions, but we're running out of time.
It'd be great if everyone could email me. So Sana and I go by Minds of POC, so just drop us a message on Twitter or Instagram, or send us an email, and book us as well, so speak to your students' unions. So this is just kind of like a very small taster session, but we go into much more detail and go into depth about different things, and it'll be specific to your university and your students' union as well, so we can really tackle the root issue at specific unis, and we're working with different unis across the country, so it can be a national way in which we support people of colour and their mental health. So book us, and we'll be more than happy to support you through your journey as SU staff and officers.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'm gonna.
No worries, this was amazing. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you for being here.
No worries. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.